If this looks familiar to you, don't adjust your screens. This is a Dacia Duster. And no, it's not the same Dacia Duster I reviewed relatively recently. This is the higher spec engine, and more specifically, it's the dual clutch automatic version. The Duster that I reviewed last year was a 1 litre turbo with a manual gearbox, and well, you can go and watch my review of that to find out what I thought, but in general you would kind of say that the 90 horsepower that it had and the 160 or so newton meters of torque it had wasn't exactly fitting for a big lumpy SUV kind of like this. This is the TCE 150 with 150 horsepower. It's also a 4-cylinder and a 1.5 litre, still turbo, and more specifically, like I said, it is mated to a dual clutch automatic transmission. That changes the driving characteristics, well, at least a little. Now you actually have a bit of power, as we'll soon demonstrate, and with the automatic or the dual clutchness, it's a lot more of a even more relaxing and sort of pacifying driving experience for the most part. Seeing as we're going down a bit of a bumpy country road, just to clarify, the suspension setup hasn't changed all that much. It's still a relatively floaty and still somewhat unrefined ride. You still don't get much sound deadening, as you just heard the motorcycle ride by, and it's still a budget vehicle for sure. And actually, speaking of the pricing, this is still one of the cheapest cars that you can buy new right now. This Journey model with the TC 150 engine and the dual clutch automatic gearbox is something around £23,000-24,000 brand new, and they even have stock of them if you wanted to go and pick one up like right now. That still makes it one of the cheapest cars on the market, and it's kind of hard to argue with the value proposition. You do definitely notice the cheaper feel to the materials, to the sound deadening, to the driving experience, but again, it's pretty hard to argue with that price tag. Seeing as the dual clutch is the thing that's most new about this car, let's talk about it. Now, because it is a sort of automated manual in a sense, that's generally what dual clutches are, what you get is a somewhat indecisive change. It obviously wants to keep the efficiency as high as possible and therefore the revs as low as possible, which is pretty similar to my Audi's dual clutch transmission, but it is a little aggressive on the downshifts, or the upshifts rather, and it's also quite quick to downshift when you put your foot in it. It doesn't take that much throttle for it to blip one gear, or a bit more throttle and it'll blip two. It's not unpredictable, you definitely get used to it, but it is a bit of a weird experience coming from what was a manual transmission in here and obviously having full control over it instead. You can still push it into manual mode if you push the gear selector to the left-hand side, and unlike in my Audi, the gear selector, the sort of manual shifting, is actually in what I would consider the right direction, where pushing down goes down a gear, or pushing away from you goes down a gear, and pulling towards you goes up a gear. With this control, you can access all 6 of the gears, although, let's face it, for the vast majority of the driving that anyone would want to do for this, you're going to keep it in its automatic mode. One nice thing about having that 150 horsepower is that, unlike in the 1 litre, where you'd be a little bit sort of pressed for overtakes, this does have the capability to do that. It's still not exactly the fastest car on the planet by any stretch of the imagination, but you do have enough power to happily cruise on the motorway, although the fact that it's only a 6-speed dual clutch transmission means that if you're sitting at motorway speeds, you're over 2,000 RPM. In fact, I'm at 2,500 RPM right now, and that's less than enjoyable experience, especially with the lack of sound deadening. There's also the ride and handling part, which, because it's relatively high, the suspension is relatively soft, and generally everything is quite soft about it, and even the steering is ridiculously light. It feels not necessarily unstable, but it's not a firm and planted driving experience, especially at speed. I'll say that. If you're planning on using this for longer journeys, it's not the most enjoyable thing. The lack of sound deadening means that the sound can sort of get a bit on the droney side. You end up with a bit of sort of noise fatigue. Also, things like the seats aren't exactly the most comfortable things in the world. And for longer journeys, again, that kind of eats into you. The car itself has no problem doing the longer journeys. It will happily do it, and it's actually relatively efficient too. But it's not something that you would enjoy doing longer journeys in for sure. If you are crazed enough to want to do some spirited driving in a big, tall SUV, well, no.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is fun.
As for braking, on a big car like this, it's kind of important for that to be quite good. And do you know what? That's actually not that bad. I'm not that worried about it. You do actually have drum brakes on the back, which always seems like a bit of a weird choice on a vehicle in 2023, but even the remarkably small disc brakes up front seem to do a pretty good job too, so yeah, that's pretty decent. Good grip, even though it's wet out. So that's confidence inspiring, even if the rest of the handling isn't. The gearbox, obviously being a dual clutch automatic, has somewhat of a mind of its own anyway, but this is a bit of a weird one. I'm very much used to a dual clutch automatic in my Audi S4, but this has some weird characteristics. It's obviously a little sluggish to change compared to my S4. It's obviously, the S4 is a bit more of a performance vehicle. This obviously isn't, but the other thing is, it seems to not be able to make up its mind what gear it wants to be in, especially when going up hills. I was going the other way up this hill a minute ago, and I was at a constant throttle position. My foot was perfectly steady, and yet it was bouncing between gears and we were sort of lurching around a bit. That sort of thing happens a fair bit. Also, there's quite a lurch from first into second. That's quite normal with dual clutches still, but it's something to be aware of, that it's not necessarily the smoothest driving experience with this dual clutch. Although I still would likely prefer having this in this sort of car. For the sort of driving that the majority of people who want to buy one of these would do, the dual clutch automatic takes another sort of step of the driving experience away, which is actually a good thing. It makes it easier, it makes it more relaxing, it makes it so that you can just jump in it, go to the shops, whatever, go see your family, and you don't even have to worry about the gears at all. It just manages it for you. And for this sort of vehicle, I think that's a pretty good fit. And speaking of the gearbox and, you know, the model, the TCE 150 is the only engine that you can get with this dual clutch, and you're looking at about £3,500 more for this model compared to the 1 litre that I reviewed last time. Honestly, for that kind of price, I think it might be worth it, because you get a considerable amount more horsepower, 60 horsepower more. You get a considerable amount more torque at 250 newton meters instead of 160, and you get this, frankly, funky dual clutch automatic, which again, for the driving experience that you would expect an owner of this to have, I think it's the better choice, and it still keeps it a relatively good value too. One of the other interesting features that the Duster has is start-stop. It's quite aggressive in how quickly it turns the engine off, and that's actually quite to its detriment, because when you come to a stop, especially on a hill, especially say at a roundabout, it takes a considerable amount of time for the engine to turn back on. I'm going to lift my foot off, and about 3 seconds before we start to move at all. That's kind of a problem, because when you get to something like a roundabout, especially if it's on a slight incline and say there's people behind you, you have to let your foot off of the brake for the engine to turn back on. But if you let your foot off the brake, then the car's going to roll backwards because the engine isn't on and the gearbox isn't holding torque. So you will need to still use the handbrake just like you would in a clutched car, which is something that I'm not used to, and you would definitely need to get used to, because it rolls quite a fair bit. Speaking of some more of the quirks and features, this car has blind spot monitoring, and one of the interesting things is that it has a lot of false positives, like a lot. As we've just been driving along this literally empty, standard road, both sides have been tripping quite regularly. It's somewhat distracting because they've made the lights relatively bright now, which is a good thing, but also it means that it comes on quite a lot, even when you're not, in a dual carriageway or, anyone is actually around you or beside you. It seems to pick up almost anything, which is fine. I mean, I'd rather them to tell me that there was something there when there isn't than to not tell me there was something there when there actually was, so I suppose that's fine. One thing to note with this version of this model is that this is the slightly rebranded version of Dacia. You get the new badge on the front, although you have lost the actual physical badging on the back, and it's replaced with a Duster sticker, which is less quality, but it's sort of a less budget look to it. It certainly looks more, not necessarily premium, but less of a budget brand necessarily, and I think for the sort of people who want to buy this, that might be a good thing. I think with this review and with all reviews in general, it's important to remember who this sort of car, this thing is for, and I mean the obvious answer is not me, but for the sort of person who it is for, I think they've tailored it quite well. You still get creature comforts like fully wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. You still get things like auto wipers and cruise control. It's nice enough in here. The interior quality isn't, so bad that you wouldn't want to touch it with a barge pole or anything. It's nice enough, and at least from what we've seen, it's relatively consistent in its, manufacturing quality. There's still a few little weird things, like the fuel filler door has had a pretty consistent issue for multiple versions now, but it's a nice enough driving experience for the sort of people who would want it, and especially at this price point, it becomes relatively hard to argue, especially for a new car, that any of these things aren't at least good enough. It's obviously not a premium vehicle by any stretch of the imagination, but again, it's hard to argue. Of course, that's my thoughts on the Dacia Duster, but I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Is this a car that you would get yourself? Would you, go for maybe something a little lower to the ground? Please. Like the Dacia Sandero, the Dacia Sandero, as May would say. Or is your budget more for, would you rather spend this like 24 grand on like a used car where you can get arguably a lot better vehicles for that kind of money, although admittedly not with a brand new 3-year warranty, etc. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. If you do like these sorts of kind of idiot drives his friend's dad's car, then hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell notification icon. We have the SMMT day coming up very shortly, so we'll have some actually brand new and hopefully exciting cars to be driving then. And yeah, that's kind of it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Check out some more videos in the end cards, and we'll see you on the next video.